So as I was talking about the biological, cultural, and environmental feedback loop, we need to remember that they're always working in relation to one another. Um, so, for instance, uh, as the ice age ended, it became wetter and warmer. So humans adapted their culture to be agricultural. So we started creating more and more crops and foodstuffs. That made us a little bit more monocropped, so wheat became an important crop. We then, especially if we're talking about Middle East, Northern Africa, and then Europe, um, that then affected our biology, right? We became kind of um, had to start to tolerate gluten. Those of us who couldn't, obviously, there were issues there. I'm not going to survive to breeding age. Um, Also, we started lacking certain vitamins, so our average lifespan actually dropped when agriculture first started. Now, that also had that cultural adaptation to the environment had environmental impacts. So we started clearing land to create these crops, which then created areas for mosquitoes that then created malaria. Malaria then impacted us biologically in terms of obviously killing some of us off and not, but also sickle cell anemia having that allele, that trait, allowed us to survive against malaria. So we start to see some biological responses to the environment that the culture actually caused. So this is on a constant feedback loop. Um, Realize they're all three very, very important. As an anthropologist, obviously, I think that culture kind of stands out in this group. I'm definitely on the side of nurture. I believe that biology is important, but culture has adapted and changed so much of who we are and how we live. Average lifespans, modern medicine, all of those things are big. Now, obviously, currently we talk a lot about the environment, global warming, those kinds of things. Culture is having an impact on that. What is that doing to our biology? We're starting to see some environmental shifts that may start to lead to things like famine and disease and all of those other things. So that feedback loop is constantly there, and we need to constantly be aware of that loop. Popular views of natives and their contributions. Um, you know, a lot of people, especially the mantra, viewed natives as savages. Again, this would be backed up by things like Morgan and Spencer when they were talking about them. Warlike, who just kind of murder without regard. Um, and then you also had kind of the flip side, which was Jefferson's idea of the noble savage. Jefferson, remember, really believed in nature, that the divine lives in nature. So he believed that the native groups actually were closer to that natural state, and he believed that there was definitely something noble about that. Um, the noble savage fades through time as America and other colonial groups start to head west, um, and they are then more portrayed like the warlike savages. Now we need to anthropology has to kind of go back and re look at some history. For instance, Jamestown, 1607, when those boats land, ultimately the Powhatans are very nice actually to the Europeans that show up, the British people that show up. They help them out, they feed them, they teach them how to grow food. What happens is the Europeans then they start to think that the natives are their slaves or helpers and are just going to do these things. And this starts to cause some resentment. Also, the Europeans instantly start to put up walls. And again, this is a form of private property and boundary territory. And the natives don't understand that and see that as kind of missing the point of life. So then you have a clash of worldviews, really. Out of that, you get, you know, certain battles, wars, those kinds of things are coming out of this conflict. And this warlike group trying to protect their cultural traditions um, ultimately is portrayed as they're the bad guys. And America did this with Native Americans in deep regard, right? Names and how they come to be. Native groups used to just call themselves people in their own language, right? For instance, here in Tehachapi, the group called themselves Nua, and Nua just meant people. Okay, and you find this all over the place. Everybody just called themselves the name for people, which is what they were. They were people. They didn't have necessarily names. Again, borders and those kinds of things didn't really work, right? So if you met another people with a different language, which everybody had a different dialect and language around, they would say, "We're this group. We're named people," right? So this is hard for Europeans and Americans to understand as well. And a lot of times, the groups or the tribes that were willing to help the Americans ended up telling the Americans the name they had for the people, and then that's how we named them, right? Um, Again, the Navajo called the Anasazi like ruthless, bad ancestors or something like that. And that name has kind of stuck around, right? Is that the actual name that the people called them? No. Okay, so again, we get into ethnocentric ideas. And a lot of times this is coming out of conflict created by the colonial era. Okay. Natives become feared based on ethnocentrism. Again, the idea that Americans or British or French were living, or Spanish, were living their lives the way that should be lived, and that the native groups were not, and that they were lesser than. And again, Morgan and other early anthropologists helped to solidify these ideas, which were these people dug around in the dirt, they foraged, they ate bugs, and all of these other kinds of natural things to do in terms of human survival, were judged based on their own views of them being right about living and how to live. There was definitely a propaganda machine around this, which, again, it told this story of natives being headhunters or scalpers or all of these other things. And this gets blown up in the media, Westerns, all of those ideas, right? And really what it came down to was the idea of we should either, as Americans, should convert them to civilization or exterminate them. And this became kind of the big push in terms of westward expansion and manifest destiny, right? Anthropologists, we, on the other hand, try to look at that as a failed policy and an ethnocentric idea, right? America, even Jefferson, who believed in the noble savage and had all these nice things to say about him, and actually did an archaeological dig on a Native American burial site. Ultimately, during his presidency, he starts moving towards removing them. After Lewis and Clark came back, he is basically he thinks that they're interesting individuals, but that they need to get out of the way of, aka progress. And this is where the word progress kind of doesn't necessarily mean what it means to everybody all the time. It can be used in different ways. And colonists, for the most part, wanted the land. Again, this gets into private property and territory, and they were okay with these, national policies to remove them, to get the native groups out of the way. So, a lot of these popular views of natives are issues of information, our own enculturation, and ethnocentrism. We really need to go back and look at function and what was really happening there, right? I mean, your book points out that their natives still probably had some warfare. It's still debated in anthropology if warfare, actually true warfare, total war, like we know it, started when the horse was introduced in the 1500s. It's hard to prove that it existed prior to that. And if it did, it might have been groups competing over resources like the Anasazi when the weather changed and whatnot. So we need to understand the impetus for some of these things and some of these thinking. I'm not here to say that every native group has never committed violence or war or in some way, but we need to really go back and look at history and the colonial era to see how much impact we had on those groups, and what influences we did kind of pass down in terms of practices, and then what they adapted as a form of survival against kind of this cultural destruction that they were seeing. In terms of their contributions, a lot of times we talk about natives as being very nature smart or the first ecologists, and they did obviously pass down everything they know about New World food, right? And when we look at New World food, you guys would be amazed if you look up the Columbian Exchange and see everything from the New World. I know we studied this in like fourth grade, but it's fun to go back and look at, right? Like everything from chocolate, vanilla, squash, corns, beans, avocado, pineapple, quinoa, all the healthy stuff really comes from the New World, including aspirin, painkiller, right? So it's coming out of the coca plant. There are so many things here in the New World that really were used by these natives and contributed largely to who we are in terms of how we eat and our biology. Um, Quinine comes from the cinchona tree in Peru that fights off malaria, right? So there's a lot of things here that the natives knew about and still know about. I every time I go out and visit a native site and there's an ethnobotanist there, they're constantly there's food all around us. We just don't view it as food, but they utilized so much of this earth and the plants that are in it and the bugs that are in it to a level that it astounds me. So they contributed a lot in that way. Ideas, right? The League of Iroquois, a lot of their writings, Jefferson and some of the founding fathers used a lot of their philosophies for the founding father documents of the when America was first starting out. Lacrosse is a Native American game, so they contribute a lot. But this view that they were, I think Native groups are still trying to combat this historic viewpoint of who they are, right? And I fear that now the new one that I hear a lot is that they're drunk, right? That they're on these reservations, that they're drunk. I have relatives that say these things all the time, and it's a gross generalization, right? Because I'm with them on Thanksgiving and they're drunk, so I don't point that out. Again, so this is I think a continuation of propaganda against certain groups, and it's very ethnocentric, right? This is pretty much the last slide for the day, and this will conclude the weekly lecture. Since I assigned the video, I didn't want to be so long-winded. These are the dynamics of change, and really, when we talk about change, we really need to analyze the importance of it, right? Which is culture change, okay? And really, the two main ways that change does happen in cultures is it could be spontaneous, which is independent development, right? An individual could figure something out in terms of how to carry water up a hill or new stone tool implement, right? It's that would be a spontaneous kind of thing that is passed down culturally, right? Or it's diffused, which is spread from one other group to another group. Now, if you look across the slide at forced acculturation, that is another way of change, right? And in the Native American groups early on, America took the kids from these Native Americans and put them in boarding schools and completely changed their culture, so that then when the kids went back to their parents and the native and the reservations or whatnot, they ultimately changed their parents to be more American as well. This is a form of cultural destruction, okay? This is not necessarily diffusion, right? Diffusion is more of, when I was talking about those peripheral areas where you have one tribe meeting another tribe and they're exchanging maybe beads for acorns or acorns for deer meat, there's going to be a diffusion of ideas. And a lot of times these could be worldview ideas or technology changes, those kinds of things. And these are going to happen out of these kind of everyday interactions. So forced acculturation, again, like I was saying, would be taking the kids and actively raising them as Americans. You're basically stealing them from their culture. And then passive acculturation would be that piece where you send the kids back to their parents and the kids start to make fun of their parents, maybe for the traditional way that they dress or the way that they act. Culture change is a central study to anthropological study or a focus. And it's really important to all of us to kind of look at this change, because we are constantly changing as individuals and a country as well. Okay, some other